The governor, who seemed to enjoy my company, often invited me to his house. He always talked about helping me get started as if it were a done deal. I was supposed to take recommendation letters for several of his friends, plus a letter of credit to give me the money I needed to buy a printing press, type, and paper, and so on. He told me to come back at different times to pick up these letters when they were ready, but he always put it off. This went on until the ship, which had also been delayed several times, was finally about to leave. So when I went to say goodbye and get the letters, his secretary, Dr. Bard, came out and told me the governor was super busy writing. He said the governor would be in Newcastle before the ship arrived and would give me the letters there. Ralph, even though he was married with a child, decided to come with me on this trip. People thought he wanted to set up business contacts and get goods to sell for a commission. But I later found out that because he was unhappy with his wife's family, he planned to leave her with them and never come back. After saying goodbye to my friends and exchanging some promises with Miss Reed, I left Philadelphia on the ship, which then anchored at Newcastle. The governor was there, but when I went to his place, his secretary came out with the politest message ever. He said the governor couldn't see me because he was busy with something super important, but he'd send the letters to me on the ship and wished me a great trip and a quick return. I went back to the ship a bit confused, but I still didn't doubt him. Mr. Andrew Hamilton, a well-known lawyer from Philadelphia, had booked passage on the same ship for himself and his son. Along with Mr. Denham, a Quaker merchant, and Messrs. Onion and Russell, who ran an ironworks in Maryland, they had reserved the main cabin. So Ralph and I had to settle for a bunk in the steerage, the cheapest part of the ship, and since no one on board knew us, we were treated like regular folks. But Mr. Hamilton and his son, who was James, later a governor, went back to Philadelphia from Newcastle because the father was called back for a big payment to defend a seized ship. Just before we sailed, Colonel French came on board and showed me a lot of respect. Because of this, I got more attention, and my friend Ralph and I were invited by the other gentlemen to join them in the cabin, since there was now space. So we moved into the cabin. Knowing that Colonel French had brought the governor's official papers on board, I asked the captain for the letters I was supposed to be responsible for. He said they were all in one bag and he couldn't get to them right then, but he promised I'd have a chance to pick them out before we landed in England. I was okay with that for the time being, and we continued our journey. We had a friendly group in the cabin and lived unusually well, especially since we had all of Mr. Hamilton's supplies, which he had stocked up generously. During this trip, Mr. Denham and I became friends, and that friendship lasted his whole life. Other than that, the voyage wasn't very pleasant because we had a lot of bad weather. When we reached the English Channel, the captain kept his promise and let me look through the bag for the governor's letters. I didn't find any letters addressed to me or marked as being under my care. I picked out 6 or 7 letters that, based on the handwriting, I thought might be the promised ones, especially since one was addressed to Basket, the king's printer, and another to a stationery supplier. We arrived in London on December 24th, 1724. I went to the stationer first, as he was on my way, and gave him the letter, saying it was from Governor Keith. "I don't know anyone by that name," he said. But then he opened the letter and exclaimed, "Oh, this is from Riddleston. I've recently discovered he's a total crook, and I want nothing to do with him or any letters from him." He handed the letter back to me, turned around, and went to help another customer. I was shocked to realize these weren't the governor's letters. After thinking about it and putting the pieces together, I started to doubt if he was being honest. I found my friend Denham and told him everything. He explained what kind of person Keith was. He told me there was absolutely no chance he had written any letters for me and that no one who knew him trusted him at all. He even laughed at the idea of the governor giving me a letter of credit, saying Keith himself had no credit to give. When I expressed worry about what I should do, he advised me to try and find work in my trade. He said, "Among the printers here, you'll improve your skills, and when you go back to America, you'll be in a much better position to start your own business." Both I and the stationer happened to know that Riddlesden, the lawyer, was a real crook. He had almost ruined Miss Reed's father by convincing him to co-sign a loan for him. This letter showed there was a secret plan to harm Hamilton, who we thought was coming over with us, and that Keith was involved with Riddlesden in it. Denham, who was Hamilton's friend, thought Hamilton should know about it. So when Hamilton arrived in England shortly after, partly out of anger and dislike for Keith and Riddlesden, and partly out of goodwill towards Hamilton, I went to see him and gave him the letter. He thanked me warmly, as the information was important to him. From that day on, he became my friend, which benefited me greatly on many future occasions. But what are we to make of a governor playing such pathetic tricks and so blatantly deceiving a poor, naive young man? It was a habit he had developed. He wanted to please everyone, and since he had little to offer, he offered promises instead. Otherwise, he was a clever, reasonable man, a decent writer, and a good governor for the general public, though not for his employers, the proprietors, whose orders he sometimes ignored. Many of our best laws were his idea and were passed while he was in charge. Ralph and I were always together. We rented a place together in Little Britain for 3 shillings and 6 pence a week. That was all we could afford at the time. He found some relatives, but they were poor and couldn't help him. He now told me he planned to stay in London and never intended to go back to Philadelphia. He hadn't brought any money with him. Everything he had managed to get was spent on his travel fare. I had 15 gold coins, so he would borrow money from me now and then to get by while he looked for work. He first tried to get into acting, thinking he was good enough for the stage, but Wilkes, whom he approached, honestly told him not to even consider it, as he had no chance of succeeding. Then he suggested to Roberts, a publisher in Paternoster Row, that he write a weekly paper for him similar to The Spectator under certain conditions, which Roberts didn't agree to. After that, he tried to find work as a freelance writer, copying documents for stationery shops and lawyers around the Temple area, but he couldn't find any openings. I immediately found work at Palmer's, a well-known printing house in Bartholomew Close at the time, and I stayed there for almost a year. I was quite hard-working, but Ralph and I spent a lot of my wages going to plays and other entertainment spots. We had spent all my gold coins, and now we were just barely getting by. He seemed to completely forget his wife and child, and I, little by little, forgot my promises to Miss Reed. I only ever wrote her one letter, and that was to tell her I probably wouldn't be coming back soon. This was another big mistake in my life, one I'd wish to fix if I could live it again. Actually, because of our spending, I was always unable to save enough for my return trip. At Palmer's, I was working as a typesetter for the second edition of Wollaston's Religion of Nature. Since some of his arguments didn't seem well-founded to me, I wrote a short philosophical essay commenting on them. It was called A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain. I dedicated it to my friend Ralph and printed a small quantity. This made Mr. Palmer see me more as a clever young man, even though he strongly disagreed with the ideas in my pamphlet, which he found terrible. Printing this pamphlet was another mistake. While I was living in Little Britain, I met Wilcox, a bookseller whose shop was right next door. He had a huge collection of used books. Lending libraries weren't common back then, but we agreed that, for some reasonable terms, which I've now forgotten, I could borrow, read, and return any of his books. I considered this a huge benefit and took advantage of it as much as possible. My pamphlet somehow ended up with a surgeon named Lyons, who wrote a book called The Infallibility of Human Judgment. This led to us becoming acquainted. He paid a lot of attention to me, often visited to talk about those topics, took me to the Horns, a pub in Lane, Cheapside, and introduced me to Dr. Mandeville, the author of The Fable of the Bees. Mandeville ran a club there and was the life of the party, a very witty and fun companion. Lyons also introduced me to Dr. Pemberton at Bateson's Coffee House, who promised to give me a chance to see Sir Isaac Newton sometime, which I really wanted to do, but it never happened. I had brought a few interesting items with me, the main one being a purse made of asbestos, which can be cleaned by fire. Sir Hans Sloane heard about it, came to see me, and invited me to his house in Bloomsbury Square. There he showed me all his own curiosities and convinced me to let him add my purse to his collection, for which he paid me a good amount.
A young woman, a milliner, lived in our house. I think she had a shop in the cloisters. She was well-mannered, intelligent, lively, and a very pleasant conversationalist. Ralph would read plays to her in the evenings. They became close. She moved to another place, and he followed her. They lived together for a while, but since he was still unemployed and her income wasn't enough to support them and her child, he decided to leave London and try to find work at a country school. He thought he was well suited for it because he had excellent handwriting and was good at math and accounting. However, he considered this job beneath him. Confident that he'd have better luck in the future, and not wanting anyone to know he'd once had such a humble job, he changed his name and did me the honor of using mine. Soon after, I got a letter from him telling me he had settled in a small village, in Berkshire, I think, where he taught reading and writing to 10 or 12 boys for 6 pence each per week. He also recommended Mrs. T to my care and asked me to write to him, addressing the letter to Mr. Franklin, schoolmaster, at that specific place. He kept writing often, sending me long sections of an epic poem he was working on and asking for my comments and corrections. I gave him feedback occasionally, but I mostly tried to discourage him from continuing. One of Young's satires had just been published. I copied and sent him a large portion of it, which clearly showed how foolish it was to pursue poetry, the muses, with any hope of getting ahead financially. It was all useless. Pages of the poem kept arriving with every mail delivery. Meanwhile, Mrs. T, having lost her friends and business because of him, was often in trouble. She used to send for me and borrow whatever I could spare to help her out. I grew fond of spending time with her, and at that time, not being bound by religious rules and assuming I was important to her, I tried to get too close, another mistake. She properly rejected my advances and told him what I had done. This caused a rift between us. When he returned to London, he told me he felt I had erased all the favors he owed me. So I realized I could never expect him to pay me back what I had lent or advanced him. However, this wasn't a big deal at the time, as he was completely broke, and losing his friendship actually felt like a burden lifted. I now started thinking about saving some money, and, hoping for better work, I left Palmer's to work at Watts's, a much larger printing house near Lincoln's Inn Fields. I stayed there for the rest of my time in London. When I first started at this printing house, I chose to work on the printing press, thinking I needed the physical exercise I was used to in America, where press work and typesetting were often combined. I only drank water. The other workmen, about 50 of them, were heavy beer drinkers. Sometimes I would carry a large frame of type in each hand up and down the stairs, while others could only manage one with both hands. They were amazed to see, from this and other examples, that the water American, as they called me, was stronger than them, even though they drank beer. We had a boy from the pub who was always at the printing house to bring drinks to the workmen,
My press partner drank a pint every day before breakfast, a pint with his bread and cheese at breakfast, a pint between breakfast and lunch, a pint at lunch, a pint around 6 in the afternoon, and another when he finished work for the day. I thought it was a terrible habit, but he believed it was necessary to drink beer so he could be strong enough to work. I tried to convince him that the physical strength beer provided was only proportional to the grain or flour from the barley dissolved in the water it was made from. I argued that a penny's worth of bread had more flour, so if he ate that with a pint of water, it would give him more strength than a quart of beer. He kept drinking anyway, though, and had to pay 4 or 5 shillings out of his wages every Saturday night for that intoxicating drink, an expense I didn't have. And that's how these poor guys always kept themselves down.
After a few weeks, Watts wanted me in the composing room, so I left the pressman. The typesetters then demanded a new bienvenue, welcome fee, or drink money of 5 shillings from me. I thought it was unfair, since I had already paid a fee downstairs. The boss agreed and told me not to pay it. I refused for 2 or 3 weeks, and as a result, I was treated like an outcast. They played so many little tricks on me, mixing up my type, swapping my pages, messing up my work, and so on, whenever I left the room, and they blamed it all on the chapel ghost, which they claimed haunted anyone not properly initialized. So despite the boss's protection, I realized it was foolish to be on bad terms with people I had to work with every day, and I ended up having to pay the money. Now I was on good terms with them and quickly gained a lot of influence. I suggested some sensible changes to their chapel rules and got them passed, despite everyone's objections. Following my example, many of them stopped their dull breakfast of beer, bread, and cheese. They found that with me, they could get a large bowl of hot water gruel, sprinkled with pepper, with breadcrumbs and a bit of butter, from a nearby house, for the price of a pint of beer, that is, 3 halfpence. This was a more comfortable and cheaper breakfast, and it kept their minds clearer. Those who kept drinking beer all day often ran out of credit at the pub because they didn't pay. They used to try to get me to help them get beer. Their water American, as they phrased it, was their guarantor. I would watch the pay table on Saturday night and collect what I had guaranteed for them, sometimes having to pay almost 30 shillings a week on their behalf. This, along with being considered a pretty good haranguer, meaning a witty verbal satirist, maintained my standing in the group. My consistent attendance, I never took a Saint Monday, meaning I never skipped work on Monday after a weekend of drinking, made the boss like me, and my unusually fast typesetting skills meant I was put on all urgent jobs, which usually paid better. So things were going very well for me now.
My place in Little Britain was too far away, so I found another one on Duke Street, across from the Catholic chapel. It was on the 3rd floor, 2 flights up, at the back of an Italian warehouse. A widow ran the house. She had a daughter, a maid, and a journeyman who worked at the warehouse but lived elsewhere. After checking my references at my previous lodging, she agreed to take me in at the same rate, 3 shillings and 6pence a week. She said it was cheaper because she expected to feel safer having a man living in the house. She was an elderly widow. She had been raised Protestant, being a clergyman's daughter, but her husband, whom she deeply respected, had converted her to Catholicism. She had spent a lot of time among important people and knew countless stories about them, going all the way back to the time of Charles II. She had gout in her knees, so she rarely left her room and sometimes wanted company. Her conversation was so entertaining to me that I made sure to spend an evening with her whenever she asked. Our supper was just half an anchovy each on a tiny piece of bread and butter, and a half a pint of ale shared between us. But the real enjoyment came from her conversation. Because I always kept good hours and caused little trouble, she didn't want me to leave. So when I mentioned a place I'd heard of closer to my work for 2 shillings a week, which, since I was focused on saving money, would have made a difference, she told me not to even consider it. She said she would reduce my rent by 2 shillings a week from then on. So I stayed with her for 1 shilling and 6pence for the rest of my time in London. In the attic of her house lived a 70-year-old unmarried lady who lived a very secluded life. My landlady told me that this woman was a Roman Catholic who, when young, had been sent abroad and stayed in a convent with the intention of becoming a nun. However, the foreign country didn't suit her, so she returned to England. Since there were no convents there, she had vowed to live as much like a nun as possible given the circumstances. So she had given all her money to charity, keeping only £12 a year to live on. Even from this small amount, she still gave a lot to charity, living herself only on water gruel and using fire only to boil it. She had lived in that attic for many years, allowed to stay for free by the Catholic tenants who lived below, as they considered it a blessing to have her there. A priest visited her every day for confession. I've asked her, my landlady said, how she, living the way she does, could possibly have so much to confess. Oh, she replied, it's impossible to avoid sin. I was allowed to visit her once. She was cheerful, polite, and spoke pleasantly. The room was clean, but had no furniture other than a mattress, a table with a crucifix and a book, a stool she offered me to sit on, and a picture above the fireplace of Saint Veronica, showing her handkerchief with the miraculous image of Christ's bleeding face on it, which she explained to me very seriously. She looked pale, but was never sick. I offer this as another example of how life and health can be sustained on a very small income. At Watts Printing House, I became friends with a clever young man named Wygate. He had rich relatives, so he was better educated than most printers. He was decent at Latin, spoke French, and loved to read. I taught him and a friend of his to swim in just 2 trips to the river, and they quickly became good swimmers. They introduced me to some gentlemen from the countryside who traveled by boat to Chelsea to see the college and Don Saltero's collection of oddities. On our way back, at the company's request, Wygate had piqued their interest. I stripped down and jumped into the river. I swam from near Chelsea to Blackfriars, doing many impressive tricks both above and below the water along the way, which surprised and delighted those who hadn't seen such things before. Since childhood, I had always loved swimming. I had studied and practiced all of Thevenot's swimming techniques and positions, and even added some of my own, trying to be graceful and effortless as well as effective. I took this opportunity to show all these skills to the group and was very flattered by their admiration. Wygate, who wanted to become an expert swimmer, became even more attached to me because of this, and also because we shared similar interests. He eventually suggested we travel all over Europe together, supporting ourselves by working in our trade wherever we went. I was tempted by the idea, but when I mentioned it to my good friend Mr. Denham, with whom I often spent time when I was free, he talked me out of it. He advised me to focus only on returning to Pennsylvania, which he was about to do himself. I have to mention one particular quality of this good man. He had previously run a business in Bristol, but went bankrupt, owing money to several people. He settled his debts for a reduced amount and moved to America. There, by working hard as a merchant, he made a lot of money in just a few years. When he returned to England on the same ship as me, he invited his old creditors to a dinner. At the dinner, he thanked them for being so lenient when he settled his debts. When they expected nothing more than the meal, each man, after the first course, found under his plate a bank order for the full amount of what he still owed them, plus interest. He now told me he was going back to Philadelphia and planned to bring a large amount of goods to open a store there. He offered to take me with him as his clerk. I would keep his accounts, which he would teach me, copy his letters, and work in the store. He added that as soon as I understood the merchant business, he would promote me by sending me with a shipment of flour, bread, and other goods to the West Indies. He would also get me profitable commissions from other people, and if I handled things well, he would set me up comfortably. I liked the idea because I was tired of London, fondly remembered the happy months I'd spent in Pennsylvania, and wanted to see it again. So I immediately agreed to the terms of £50 a year, Pennsylvania money. This was less than I was currently earning as a typesetter, but it offered a better future. I said goodbye to printing, or so I thought, forever. I was busy every day with my new job, going around with Mr. Denham to different tradesmen to buy various items, making sure they were packed, running errands, urging workmen to finish quickly, and so on. Once everything was on board, I had a few days off. One of those days, to my surprise, I was summoned by a prominent man I only know by name, Sir William Wyndham, and I went to see him. He had somehow heard about my swim from Chelsea to Blackfriars, and that I had taught Wygate and another young man to swim in just a few hours. He had 2 sons who were about to go traveling, and he wanted them to learn to swim first. He offered to pay me well if I would teach them. His sons hadn't arrived in town yet, and my stay was uncertain, so I couldn't take on the job. But this incident made me think that if I stayed in England and opened a swimming school, I could probably make a lot of money. The idea impressed me so much that if the offer had come sooner, I probably wouldn't have returned to America so quickly. Many years later, you and I had a more important interaction with one of Sir William Wyndham's sons, who became the Earl of Egremont, which I'll talk about when the time comes. So I spent about 18 months in London. Most of that time I worked hard at my job and spent very little on myself, except for going to plays and buying books. My friend Ralph had kept me broke. He owed me about £27, which I was now unlikely to ever get back, a huge amount considering my small earnings. Despite all that, I still liked him because he had many good qualities. I certainly hadn't gotten richer, but I had met some very clever people whose conversations greatly benefited me, and I had read a lot.